talk a little bit about budgeting today for both fruits and vegetables, and when we think about enterprise budgets, right, we're thinking about the fact that we need to do some planning. It is really essential, going into the production of any, agricultural product, that one considers what that full cost of production is going to be. And so I'm going to break this down a little bit, how they're designed, speak a little bit about what are enterprise budgets and all of the components that ultimately go into this. Keep in mind that enterprise budgets are not actual cost of production. So it's not based on what you did in the past year, although that can be used to form a future budget. It's really about what you're planning to do. And so sometimes these are based on extension recommended practices, but we know that sometimes farmers do things a little bit differently, so that practices can vary from producer to producer. And so there are a variety of methods that can be used for production, and so that's why it's really important that producers look at their own budget. And so while land grant institutions such as Auburn and Alabama Extension produce enterprise budgets and do make those available, they are just supposed to be a guide. They are not the absolute cost of production. So I just always like to encourage producers really to think about what their costs are and to budget on their own and use any enterprise budgets from Extension strictly as a guide on how they can think about developing their own budget. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And just kind of looking at the crops grown in Alabama here. This actually is 2017, but fruits and vegetable crops, with at least 250 acres in production is, there's a number of different crops that we're growing here. It's very diverse in terms of agriculture in the state. And so, we look at different budget processes that may involve whether they're annuals or perennials. Even we can talk about different budgets for different varieties and the different input practices that go into play. There are differences in size of operations that are ultimately going to yield some differences in production practices and differences in costs. And so all of these get factored into, developing that enterprise budget. If you think about certain, blueberries, for instance, where you've got to, develop the bush and may not produce as well during that first year compared to subsequent years. You have to think about that difference in terms of the budget, where you may have a few years that you're not going to produce an optimal amount, but you're still going to have that input costs. And so that's some of those differences between annuals and perennials, where you're going to get a crop every year by trans putting in transplants or seed. As I mentioned, in terms of size, we know in Alabama we've got a variety of different sizes in terms of producers and farms with a different amount of acreage. And so, a farm that's you've got acres, less than an acre. We've got a number of those that are selling vegetables, commercially, and so those costs are going to be quite different than if we've got somebody at 200, 250 acres that's buying larger volume and has need for potentially additional labor or other inputs at a much greater scale. And so the first thing that it really starts with in terms of budgeting is thinking about record keeping. It is really essential that as you're producing year after year, or if you're starting off even, setting up a good record keeping system, because that record keeping is going to allow you to develop future budgets. You're going to be able to understand what your costs are that you're incurring, and how much of that time is involved There's a dedicated time that you have to put to actually keeping track of what your expenses are and keeping track of what your costs are and that record keeping. But at the same time, there's also all the time that goes into the actual production. And so understanding where that time is being spent, and making sure that you're doing that record keeping as well, is vitally important. That third bullet point there, just in terms of labor, labor can be tricky. And so knowing where that time is being spent on the farm, for what needs to be done, and allocating that to potentially different enterprises as well. We know producers don't always produce, and rarely produce just one crop. They often will produce multiples. And so when you budget, you're budgeting for a single crop. You're budgeting separately for tomatoes compared to sweet corn or watermelons. And so doing a time study can look to see where that labor can be allocated to different crops that you may have on the farm. Part of that record keeping system is involved with, keeping all those receipts and the invoices. And, producers often do this for the sake of, taxes at the end of the year and things like that. And so certainly you could do it in paper form, you can do it in software. Um, some producers, we know that they will keep records and keep all their receipts in a shoebox and go through it at the end of the year. I like to encourage folks to do it more often than just once a year, because it really gets you to think about what those input costs are and to keep track of what's going there on, and allows you to really think about that budget process moving forward. Like I said, in taxes, that's one of the goals of record keeping. And um, you know, when you file a Schedule F as part of your taxes, you're going to be asked to account for these farm expenses. And, there's a lot of categories that you see here on the Schedule F that when we look at a budget, and I'll show you some of these, we're going to be talking about the same categories, right? What kind of vehicle expenses do you have? What kind of chemical expenses do you have? Are you, in terms of fertilizer or gasoline, insurance? On the right-hand side, you can see here seeds and plants. That's certainly one on the fruit and vegetable side that is pretty significant. Custom hire, whether it be machine work, and labor hired, number 22 down there, is labor is one of the biggest expenses, in terms of fruits and vegetables. And so you need it for the Schedule F, but why not also use that for other purposes? And another purpose that often comes into play where it's necessary is for loan applications. This is a section of an FSA loan application, where it asks for expenses as part of an operating plan. So again, you're seeing the same type of categories that was on that Schedule F that we will use in terms of setting up budgets. What are those seed expenses? What is that rent for, if you do custom work in terms of machinery that you're paying for, or potentially, land rent, if you don't own that land, the amount of labor again, right? All of these items, go on, as part of that loan application. So keeping those records, multiple purposes, right? Borrowing, taxes, and then also setting up an enterprise budget. And so again, you see very similar categories here. We set up enterprise budgets based on a combination of variable costs and fixed costs. And so looking at those variable costs, these are going to be the costs that are going to vary based on either the units produced, the amount that you actually produce and harvest, or the acres of production. And so, or the area of production. So often we think about it on a per acre basis, which you could certainly use some other unit of measure, but we think about it on that per unit, such as a per acre basis. And so, we'll do soil tests, include fertilizer, the transplants or seed, if you're going to start from seed. That might starting from seed might involve a greenhouse operation to begin with. And so all of those things need to be considered. But you're thinking about on these pre-harvest items, these are very much by the area of production, in terms of how much land is going to be produced. And we think about it on, again, kind of like a per acre basis of what is going to be included there. Under harvest, that unit of production is, in terms of variable cost, is going to be how much actually is produced in the case of labor, because obviously if you produce more, you're going to ultimately need, more people in terms of picking, and the boxes or buckets and the marketing is going to be more. And so some of that needs to be based on how much you're actually producing there. Post-harvest machinery, though, if there is any machinery that's being used, at that stage, right, that often can be potentially in terms of the area of production as well. And you have to remember interest on operating capital, as well. So anytime that you are borrowing money, and ultimately paying interest, there is something that needs to be budgeted in that as well. And we know that often producers will borrow for their operating expenses, because you've got from a cash flow perspective, you've got all the expenses up front, and then ultimately, the sale of that product is coming later on, and so those operating rates are essential. Moving beyond variable costs, we then start thinking about fixed costs, right? And so costs that are going to occur even without production. So if in fact, you did not produce anything in a field for a given year, you still would have, if you've got irrigation on the land, you've got depreciation on that. If you own machinery, there's depreciation on that as well. That, considering essentially that gradual loss of value and that wear and tear that's occurring, you still need to contribute something to that in terms of your expenses. If you're renting land, you might have had land rent as part of your variable cost, or you have land ownership, so some return to land, that you're entitled to for having that ownership, and to consider that as a fixed cost. And then some miscellaneous overhead. So, some of those other items that, that you need to, not necessarily crop specific, but certainly overhead to the farm that you allocate across the different enterprises that you have. Sometimes you do that based on the area of production, sometimes based on how much is being produced, unless you can actually allocate specific items. But thinking about, telephones, internet access, maybe attending, various conferences, or having subscriptions to magazines, or record keeping software, things like that, right? Where you have various overhead, that you need to allocate towards a specific enterprise. And so on these slides, I had enterprise budgets as tomato here, but I mean, that's just an example. This could be anything. I'm just going to go through an example in this presentation on tomatoes. You have your total costs then, which are your combination of your variable costs and your fixed cost. And ultimately that allows you to determine some type of return to that labor, land, or capital, depending on what you've included in your fixed cost, and a return to operator labor as well. And, we say that because often producers will not pay themselves a wage. So labor, right, goes back here on your variable cost. Will ultimately have some type of labor involved there for harvesting, or even, pre-harvest, we should have some type of labor. But the operator labor may not be actually paid. And so you need to consider that the return, the difference between that, the receipts that you have, the price that you receive for the product, and what your total costs are, is going to ultimately, has to cover that operator labor time, that unpaid labor time. And so, you can go through this using also a sensitivity analysis that ultimately looks at different scenarios. And so, thinking about, well, if in a budgeting perspective, what if this is my expected yield, but what if my yield is 10% more, or 20% more, or 10% or 20% less because it's a dry year and I don't have irrigation? What if the price varies in different ways, right? Am I going to be able to cover my variable and my fixed costs? Will there be some return to my unpaid labor? Will there be some return to my land or capital that I have invested, based on, a range of yields or prices that may occur? Because again, this is pre-season work that you're doing, trying to plan for that upcoming year and trying to see, okay, this is what my costs are going to be, and this would be my break-even price. And that can help determine marketing opportunities, right? Because you want to make sure you cover that break-even price, or maybe break even just based on variable costs, right? You need to kind of feel the market and see where things are at. But having that budget can give you that guide, in terms of how to market, how to price your product, and making sure that you're covering all of your costs. So let's dig into an example of an enterprise budget. And there's a lot of details that go into this, and I'm going to zoom into some certain areas and talk about them in a little bit more. But this is an example of an enterprise budget for tomatoes, where you've got your pre-harvest and harvest variable costs, and broken down into different components, where you've got your units, and the quantity, a cost per unit, and then the total per acre, because this was based on an acre estimate. And then, we have a section there for your farm, with the idea that, you should think about, well, what is it actually going to cost you? And so let's zoom into a few of these in some of these areas and talk in a little bit more detail. Starting from the top, again, that's soil test. So in this example, it's, $7 per acre for a soil test, right? Allowing you to figure out what your fertilizer needs are ultimately going to be for the year. This example of tomatoes here is transplants, at $365 per acre. And then we start getting into some of the fertilizer, and you know, you'd need to figure, okay, how many tons of lime or how much nitrogen, and factoring in ultimately those costs. And so here's an example just of where fertilizer costs currently are in Alabama, and where they've been in the recent, you know, since a year ago or 5 years ago. You can see there the average price. There is a range. There is, a minimum and a maximum that the USDA publishes weekly in terms of production costs. So not everybody's paying the average price, and so a lot of that varies based on size of operation, or where you are in the state. But on average, you can see that fertilizer prices, lime's gone up a little bit from a year ago, but fertilizer prices are generally down. But compared to 5 years ago, still 45 to almost 100%, higher the average prices today compared to 5 years ago. These are not adjusted for inflation at all, and so we could certainly see the effects of inflation over time, I think, in some of this. But we do see where prices have come down from a peak, fertilizer prices, compared to a couple of years ago. Now, it is worth mentioning potash there. That is one where we may see, in particular, with some of the tariffs that are being mentioned with respect to Canada. We've got a lot of potassium that comes into the U.S. from Canada. And so if those tariffs do take effect in April 2nd, as they're expected to, then, we're likely going to see fertilizer prices, and potassium in particular, increase, coming up here later in the spring. So digging in a little further in terms of the enterprise budget, we've got some pre-harvest labor there, $35 per hour. And so you put in, I'm sorry, so that's actually units there. So 35 hours. Um, and so we don't actually have so you don't have a price that's coming up in there. I zoomed in a little too far. You should have a price per unit in there as well. But you're going to go through and include all of your chemicals, your herbicides, your insecticides, your fungicides, right? Thinking about the wood stakes and the twine that's necessary. So all of those pieces that are necessary for um, raising tomatoes and a cost, per stake, a cost for, per roll of twine, irrigation supplies that are necessary and what those costs are as well. As I mentioned, in terms of land rent, on this particular example, $100 per acre for land. I'll talk a little bit more about where land rent and land values have gone here in Alabama in a moment. But the other one that I wanted to mention was crop insurance. And, in our example, we've got that at $0. But and that's because, again, everybody kind of chooses different crop insurance options and what's right for them and their operation, depending on the county that they're in and what's available, either through RMA or just through FSA, or just, again, the size of their operation. But fruit and vegetable producers should always consider, at the very least, from FSA, the Non-Insured Crop Disaster Assistance Program, NAP. It can be as simple as $325 per crop for an administrative fee to get catastrophic coverage, which is 50% of an approved yield and 55% of an average market price. But there are opportunities to buy up higher levels as well. But certainly those costs should be included here in terms of the enterprise budget. So as I mentioned, land rent is part of that. And so where land values have been going here in the southern region, the USDA does collect data on land rents and land values. And you can see there, in terms of the southern region for the US, land values increased on farms in 2024 to $4,170 per acre. That was up $200 from the prior year per acre. In Alabama, it was actually increased $340 from 2023 to 2024 in terms of land values. On the cash rent side, we're also seeing these increases. In the southern region in the U.S. here, increase of $5 per acre to $160 per acre in 2024. That is a combination on the cropland side of both irrigated and non-irrigated. Irrigated acreage will generally be more expensive in terms of land rent, strictly because of that irrigation equipment that's there, and the landowner needing to consider some type of depreciation return for that equipment. In Alabama, we're looking at $74.50 on average throughout the state in 2024, but again, an increase. And so we've been seeing these increases over time in land values and in cash rents. And this is out of a land center at Texas A&M that does collect some rural land values in Alabama, split in terms of these four regions. So kind of stacked them in the top left there, the Northwest Alabama, top right Northeast, and then Southwest and Southeast on the bottom left and right respectively. And you see those increases there. These increases in the southern part of the state to $3,000-4,000 per acre, and pretty significant increases over the last 4 years compared to where we were for the prior periods. And so, we continue, even though up in that Northwest there, a little bit of a decrease in 2024 in terms of the price per acre on land. Generally, though, seeing that continued upward trend in land, and there's some question right now, excuse me, whether or not we're going to continue to see land prices and land values continue to increase. It's a little mixed, possibly not as much as we've seen in the past. And so turning back to our enterprise budgets here, we can start thinking about harvest, right? And excuse me, the post-harvest machinery that's necessary, and then the labor as well. How much ultimately we're paying for labor, the boxes that are necessary or buckets, and as I mentioned, marketing and other interest on that operating capital. So in this case, borrowing $8,000 at a 4% interest rate for a period of time. So we factor all of these in, and labor is, like I mentioned, one of the most, the largest expenses in terms of fruit and vegetable production. And we do know that, especially for larger operations, but even smaller operations, finding labor can be really, really challenging. And H-2A, the migrant labor program, ag workers program, is certainly an area that is provides opportunity to find laborers, especially for fruit and vegetable production. But what we've seen is this adverse effects wage rate, effectively that minimum wage that exists for H-2A workers, has been increasing pretty substantially in the region. And so you can see Alabama is part of kind of a region there of Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, where that adverse effects wage rate has moved from 1468 in 2024 to 1608 for 2025, so up 9.5%. And that doesn't include all the other items that are necessary to provide H-2A laborers in terms of transportation to the U.S. and back home, transportation while on the farm, the housing, cooking facility, or meals, so all of the components that go into that are on top of this wage rate. And so, certainly the labor costs are pretty substantial. And so it is important to consider what those costs are, and in terms of that entire budget structure, when figuring out, how much can you produce and where do you need to actually price your products. So some budgets that we have available through ACES are, around tomatoes, summer squash, sweet corn, sweet potatoes, southern peas, strawberries, and watermelon. And so this will again give you some idea in terms of the production practices that Extension is looking at, and some average costs that are expected there. But really, it is about taking the time to go through your records and figure out your own costs. And it really starts with thinking about that planting and or production system that you have, and so breaking that down between land preparation, what you need to do at planting, fertilizer, anything you need to do for spray programs, weed management, irrigation, right? Thinking about where those occur and when those costs happen, and ultimately what those costs are involved. Going through a system like this can actually help you as well in terms of a cash flow budget, and thinking about when you're going to need certain finances to be able to make those payments to purchase goods, pay laborers, or ultimately where you're going to have the production that you're going to sell to have that income. And so starting with a production schedule like this can help make sure also that you're including all the processes that you need to within your enterprise budget, because you would have a list of all the different components, and then that can feed into that enterprise budget. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, or even think about and talk about what the biggest challenges are in budgeting, and how you can best go about record keeping, and figuring out exactly what your costs are going to be for the upcoming growing season. There's my contact information as well. If anybody would like to reach out to me, I'm happy to answer questions now, or have further discussion. Also just gonna plug southernagtoday.org there, that QR code on the left in that website. That is a daily newsletter of Southern land grant institutions such as Auburn University and Alabama Cooperative Extension. We do contribute to this on a regular basis, but it is a collaboration of the 13 land grants throughout the southern region and does cover topics as crop marketing, livestock marketing, policy, trade, specialty crops, labor issues, things like that. So very direct, easy, short articles on a daily newsletter. So I encourage you to check that out.
If anybody has any questions for Dr. Rabinowitz, just feel free to unmute and ask, or type it in the chat, and I'll ask. I do have a comment, on the budgets. Every budget doesn't have this, but some farmers, if you grow blueberries and blackberries, or blueberries, blackberries, muscadines, or add tomatoes and squash, or more than one crop when we're talking fruit and vegetable. It's a lot of different crops sometimes, and the farmer knows what they spend and they know what they bring in, but in a way, they just have no clue. Did they make money on okra or lose money? Did they make money on tomatoes? And some of the budgets have one of my favorite things, and is one of the last things on some of our budgets, not all of them, is it'll tell you if you're in the red or the black, but it's if you're getting X dollars for your strawberries, that's making money. If you're getting, now this is just averages, I know, but if you're getting this dollar for your strawberries, you're losing money. And that for a farmer that has a lot of different crops, to me, that says a lot, because a lot of buyers will go and say, well, you take X dollars for a bushel of cucumbers. Well, you could go look at that chart and know right away, well, that's just not making money. And also, it really helps in management decisions. And I don't know your feelings on those boxes, Dr. Rabinowitz, but I kind of like them. When you're just doing one crop, it might be easy, but if you're doing a lot of crops, I love that little chart. You know what I'm talking about? Usually it's the last thing on some of these budgets.
I do, yeah. No, I think you're right, Chip. It's, so a sensitivity analysis on what is the yield and price necessary to meet the costs that are projected there, and whether or not you're going to be able to cover more than those costs that you're projecting. And so I think it's important, even if you're producing multiple crops, that you break it down on a per enterprise, per crop basis. So when I talk about enterprises, I'm talking about each individual crop. And so I think it's important to break that down on each crop, because you're going to have that price and that yield for each, and you'll be able to see, okay, what is the break even necessary in terms of the price that I need to get, or potentially, right, that box that you're talking about there is a sensitivity analysis of, okay, if I expect this yield, I know that I need to, I need to make sure I at least don't get 10% less than that, because that's where I start going into the red, right? And that I'm okay at this expected yield, but not 10% less. Or my price needs to be at least, $5 a pound, as opposed to, if I'm at $4 a pound, I'm not necessarily going to break even, and I start getting into that red again. So I think it's important to break it down based on each enterprise. And sometimes it's hard when you've got a lot of different crops, because those expenses, you buy one item that's used for multiple crops. And so you got to figure out sort of how to allocate those expenses between the different crops. But absolutely working through break-even analysis, sensitivity analysis, those are really essential in terms of making sure that you're marketing your products at a price that are going to, to be profitable.
All right.